There is a peculiar weight carried by the mind when a truth remains unspoken. It is not the mere presence of a thought that disturbs the individual, but the continuous effort required to keep it submerged beneath awareness. The psyche, by its nature, strives toward expression and balance, yet suppression interrupts this natural movement. What is withheld does not vanish. It lingers in the background, shaping emotions, coloring perceptions, and subtly influencing behavior. A person may attempt to dismiss the significance of this concealed reality, convincing themselves that silence preserves stability, yet inwardly a tension accumulates. This tension is not dramatic or explosive at first. It emerges quietly, often as restlessness, unease, or a sense of internal friction. Over time, the mind expends increasing energy, maintaining the barrier between what is known internally and what is permitted into conscious recognition. The individual is no longer simply thinking or feeling. They are managing an internal division that demands constant vigilance. The burden of the unspoken truth becomes especially potent because the human psyche is not structured for prolonged contradiction. Consciousness seeks coherence, yet concealment creates a split between inner experience and outward presentation. One part of the self guards the hidden material, while another continues engaging with daily life, often unaware of the strain this division produces. The result is frequently a diffuse anxiety without obvious origin. The individual senses something unresolved, yet struggles to articulate the source of discomfort. This is the paradox of suppression. The more firmly a truth is restrained, the more insistently it seeks indirect expression. It may surface through mood fluctuations, persistent thoughts, or inexplicable emotional reactions. Such manifestations are not random disturbances, but signals of psychic imbalance. The unspoken truth carries psychological energy, and energy within the mind cannot remain indefinitely static. When denied direct expression, it finds alternative pathways, sometimes distorting the personality's natural equilibrium. What makes this burden particularly difficult is that it often disguises itself. The individual may attribute their unease to external circumstances, relationships, or vague dissatisfaction, seldom recognizing the concealed truth as the central source of tension. Yet the psyche registers incongruence even when the intellect rationalizes it away. A subtle exhaustion may develop, not from physical effort but from the persistent act of suppression itself. To withhold a truth requires continual reinforcement of inner boundaries, a process that consumes attention and emotional resources. The person may feel inexplicably drained, irritable, or detached, unaware that their vitality is entangled in guarding what remains unsaid. In this way, silence becomes an active psychological task rather than a passive state. The mind labors to maintain order, yet the cost of this order gradually becomes evident in the individual's diminished sense of ease and spontaneity. Relief begins not with dramatic confession, but with recognition. The psyche moves toward balance when the individual allows awareness to approach what has been avoided. The burden lessens as the truth transitions from a guarded secret into an acknowledged element of inner reality. This acknowledgement does not instantly dissolve discomfort, but it restores continuity within the self. Energy previously consumed by concealment becomes available for reflection and understanding. The mind regains a measure of stability, not because the truth changes, but because the internal struggle surrounding it diminishes. What was once a source of silent pressure becomes material for conscious engagement, opening the possibility of integration. In this movement, the individual experiences a subtle but profound shift. The psyche, no longer divided against itself, begins to recover its natural sense of equilibrium. Within every individual, there exists a delicate arrangement between what is known and what is concealed, between the identity one recognizes and the aspects one instinctively avoids. The conscious self is the domain of order, intention, and social presentation. It is the part that speaks with confidence, makes decisions, and sustains the narrative of who we believe ourselves to be. Yet beneath this illuminated surface resides another presence, less visible, but no less influential. This hidden region contains impulses, fears, and tendencies that the conscious mind often refuses to acknowledge. The tension between these two dimensions is not a sign of failure, but a fundamental characteristic of the human psyche. Conflict arises when the conscious identity insists upon a narrow definition of the self, while the disowned elements persist in seeking recognition. The individual may strive for consistency, yet something within resists, creating an undercurrent of psychological friction that shapes thoughts and emotions in subtle, persistent ways. This inner opposition rarely announces itself with clarity. Instead, it reveals its presence through contradictions in behavior, unexpected reactions, and feelings that appear disproportionate to circumstances. A person may consciously value patience, yet experience sudden irritability or profess certainty while privately harboring doubt. Such inconsistencies often perplex the rational mind, which prefers linear explanations. However, the hidden dimension of the psyche operates according to different principles. That which is rejected by conscious awareness does not dissolve. It continues to exist, influencing perception and motivation from beyond direct scrutiny. The conflict, therefore, becomes cyclical. The more rigidly the conscious self denies these elements, the more forcefully they assert themselves through indirect channels. What emerges is not chaos, but an ongoing struggle for psychological balance. The individual may feel divided, sensing incompatible tendencies without fully understanding their origin. This division is neither accidental nor meaningless. It reflects the psyche's demand for a more inclusive understanding of the self. The hidden aspects often carry qualities that the conscious identity deems undesirable or incompatible with its preferred image. Yet these elements are not inherently destructive. Many contain unrealized strengths, creativity, or emotional depth that remain inaccessible precisely because they are disowned. Conflict intensifies when the individual interprets the emergence of such material as a threat rather than a message. Resistance then becomes habitual, reinforcing the separation between the known and the unknown within the psyche. This resistance consumes energy, producing fatigue, uncertainty, and a sense of internal instability. The person may attempt to restore comfort by further strengthening the conscious facade, yet the underlying tension persists. The psyche, oriented toward wholeness, does not accept permanent exclusion. What is hidden seeks not domination, but integration, urging the individual toward a broader, more realistic recognition of their own complexity. Resolution begins when the individual abandons the illusion of a flawless, singular identity and instead approaches the hidden elements with curiosity and reflection. Awareness does not eradicate conflict instantly, but it transforms its nature. What was once experienced as disruption becomes a source of insight, revealing dimensions of personality previously obscured. The conscious self expands, no longer defined by rigid boundaries but enriched by a more comprehensive understanding of inner life. In this movement, psychological energy is no longer wasted in suppression or denial. The individual discovers a greater sense of coherence, not because contradictions vanish, but because they are recognized as natural components of a multifaceted psyche. Through this gradual reconciliation, the internal struggle softens, allowing a more stable and authentic equilibrium to emerge. Fear of judgment possesses a remarkable influence over human behavior, often shaping decisions more powerfully than tangible consequences. The individual, as a social being, is deeply sensitive to the perceptions of others. for acceptance and belonging have long been intertwined with psychological security. When a person carries a truth that demands expression, this fear emerges as an invisible barrier. It is not merely the possibility of criticism that troubles the mind, but the anticipation of rejection, misunderstanding, or diminished regard. The psyche begins constructing scenarios, imagining outcomes that may never materialize, yet the emotional response to these imagined events becomes entirely real. In this state, silence appears protective, a means of preserving stability and avoiding discomfort. However, the same silence that shields the individual externally often intensifies internal pressure. The unspoken truth remains active within the mind, and the effort required to contain it gradually evolves into a source of tension that rivals the fear itself. What makes this conflict particularly compelling is the simultaneous presence of two opposing psychological forces. On one side resides the apprehension of how others might respond, fueled by deeply rooted social instincts and personal insecurities. On the other side exists an equally persistent need for release, for the psyche naturally seeks resolution of what feels incomplete or concealed. The individual may oscillate between these poles, at times convinced that concealment is wise, at other moments overwhelmed by the desire to speak. This oscillation generates a distinct form of mental fatigue. The mind repeatedly evaluates risks, revisits possibilities, and attempts to predict the unpredictable. Such internal negotiation rarely produces peace, for it is driven by uncertainty rather than clarity. The longer the conflict persists, the more the unspoken truth acquires psychological weight, transforming from a simple fact into a persistent presence that colors emotional life. Fear, once an anticipatory emotion, becomes a governing principle that restricts expression and reinforces hesitation. The intensity of this fear often stems from the exaggerated authority granted to external opinion. The individual may attribute disproportionate power to imagined judgments, perceiving them as definitive measures of worth or identity. Yet many of these anticipated reactions are speculative, constructed by the mind rather than confirmed by reality. Nevertheless, the emotional impact remains significant because the psyche responds to perceived threats with genuine urgency. In attempting to avoid discomfort, the person may inadvertently sustain a deeper unease. Suppression demands continual vigilance, requiring the individual to monitor words, gestures, and even thoughts. This sustained self-regulation consumes psychological energy, diminishing spontaneity and creating a subtle sense of constraint. The fear of judgment thus becomes self-perpetuating. Silence preserves anxiety, and anxiety reinforces silence. The individual feels trapped not by external forces, but by the internalized expectation of how those forces might manifest. Relief emerges when the individual begins reassessing the assumed magnitude of judgment and recognizing the psyche's need for congruence. Expression, whether directed outwardly or acknowledged inwardly, reduces the tension generated by concealment. The act of confronting fear does not guarantee universal approval, yet it restores a sense of agency and continuity within the self. The individual discovers that psychological stability arises less from avoidance and more from alignment between inner reality and conscious action. In this realignment, fear loses its dominance, not because uncertainty vanishes, but because the psyche no longer expends its energy resisting itself. The moral weight of suppressed guilt does not arise suddenly, nor does it announce itself with unmistakable clarity. It develops gradually, often beginning as a faint discomfort that the individual struggles to define. Guilt, in its essential form, is a psychological response to perceived misalignment between one's actions and internal values. When acknowledged, it can guide reflection, encourage correction, and restore a sense of ethical balance. Yet when this feeling is deliberately restrained, its character transforms. Suppressed guilt does not dissipate. It settles into the deeper layers of the psyche, where it continues to exert influence without the moderating effect of conscious examination. The mind may attempt to rationalize or minimize the underlying cause, but the emotional residue remains. Over time, this concealed tension acquires a peculiar persistence, manifesting as unease, irritability, or an indefinable sense of inner heaviness. The individual senses an unresolved element within, though its precise nature may remain obscured by habitual avoidance. What renders suppressed guilt particularly burdensome is its capacity to shape psychological experience indirectly. Because it lacks conscious articulation, it resists logical resolution. The individual may feel compelled to justify past decisions or reinterpret events, yet these intellectual maneuvers seldom relieve the deeper tension. The psyche, oriented toward coherence, registers the discrepancy even when awareness resists acknowledgement. This internal contradiction generates a subtle but continuous strain. Emotional reactions may appear disproportionate, patience may erode without obvious cause, and the individual may experience a recurring sense of self-criticism that seems disconnected from present circumstances. Such experiences are not arbitrary disturbances, but reflections of unresolved psychic material. Suppression demands ongoing psychological effort, requiring the individual to maintain distance from thoughts and feelings that seek recognition. In this way, guilt becomes not merely an emotion, but a sustained internal presence, one that quietly consumes energy and disturbs equilibrium. The moral dimension of guilt intensifies its psychological impact. Unlike transient anxieties, guilt is intertwined, recalling personal responsibility and self-evaluation. When left unexamined, it may subtly influence identity, fostering doubt or diminishing self-trust. The individual may attempt to move forward, yet the concealed tension acts as a persistent undertone, coloring perceptions and decisions. The psyche cannot easily reconcile what remains ethically unresolved. Attempts to ignore or silence the feeling often strengthen its influence, for repression does not neutralize emotional significance. Instead, the suppressed guilt may emerge through indirect expressions: defensiveness, restlessness, or a pervasive sense of dissatisfaction. The person may attribute these experiences to external factors, seldom recognizing their origin within the concealed moral conflict. Thus, the psychological burden grows not solely from the initial cause of guilt, but from the prolonged effort to evade its conscious recognition. Relief begins when guilt is approached not as a threat but as information. Conscious acknowledgement restores the psyche's capacity for integration, transforming an indistinct tension into material for reflection and understanding. The individual regains a sense of continuity as the concealed conflict is brought into awareness. This process does not erase discomfort instantly, but it diminishes the exhausting struggle between suppression and expression. What was once an invisible weight becomes an element of conscious experience, open to interpretation and resolution. In this movement, the psyche recovers balance, no longer strained by the silent resistance that previously sustained the burden. Inner fragmentation seldom feels dramatic at its beginning. It emerges quietly, often disguised as ordinary confusion or a vague sense of inconsistency. The individual continues daily routines, speaks, decides, and interacts. Yet beneath this functional surface, something subtle begins to divide. Secrecy plays a decisive role in this process, not because concealment is inherently harmful, but because maintaining it requires the psyche to sustain separate and often conflicting realities. One part of the mind preserves the hidden knowledge, guarding it with vigilance, while another proceeds as though no such knowledge exists. This division is rarely experienced as a clear split. Instead, it manifests as tension, hesitation, or a faint sense of disunity. The person may struggle to articulate the cause of discomfort, sensing only that their inner life lacks the coherence it once possessed. The psyche, oriented toward integration, registers this separation even when conscious awareness resists acknowledging it. Secrecy demands a continuous psychological effort that extends far beyond the initial act of concealment. Thoughts must be monitored, expressions carefully regulated, and reactions subtly adjusted to avoid unintended disclosure. Such regulation consumes mental energy, gradually reshaping the individual's emotional landscape. The mind becomes preoccupied not merely with external tasks, but with preserving internal boundaries. Over time, this sustained vigilance may produce a peculiar fatigue, one that does not always correspond to physical exertion. The individual may feel drained or restless, uncertain why ordinary interactions now require disproportionate effort. Fragmentation arises because secrecy prevents the free movement of thoughts and feelings between different layers of awareness. Instead of a unified flow of experience, the psyche operates through compartments, each governed by its own constraints. This compartmentalization, though often adaptive in the short term, can erode the sense of psychological continuity when prolonged. The consequences of such inner division are frequently subtle yet pervasive. Emotional responses may become inconsistent, self-perception may fluctuate, and decision-making may acquire an undercurrent of uncertainty. The individual may sense an internal contradiction without fully grasping its origin. Secrecy isolates certain experiences from conscious integration, and what remains isolated tends to exert influence indirectly. Irritability, doubt, or unexplained anxiety may surface, not as random disturbances but as reflections of unresolved psychic tension. The psyche resists enduring fragmentation because its natural tendency is toward wholeness. When parts of experience are persistently excluded, the internal structure of the self loses some of its stability. The individual may attempt to restore equilibrium through distraction or rationalization, yet the underlying disunity often persists. Fragmentation is not simply a state of confusion. It is the psychological cost of sustaining incompatible inner realities. Reintegration begins when the individual allows previously isolated elements to re-enter conscious awareness. This movement need not involve immediate disclosure to others. It first requires honest recognition within the self. Awareness restores connections between fragmented regions of the psyche, reducing the strain created by compartmentalization. Energy once consumed by secrecy becomes available for reflection and adaptation. The individual gradually recovers a sense of continuity, not because complexity disappears, but because the mind no longer labors to maintain rigid internal divisions. In this process, psychological stability emerges from integration rather than concealment, allowing the self to function with greater coherence and resilience. Confession, in its deepest psychological sense, is not merely the disclosure of information, but an act of inner alignment. The human psyche strives naturally toward unity, yet this unity is often disturbed when certain thoughts, emotions, or memories are withheld from conscious recognition. What remains unacknowledged does not become inert. It persists as an active element within the inner world, shaping perception and generating tension. In this condition, the individual may feel divided, as though parts of the self exist in quiet opposition. Confession represents a movement against this division. It is the deliberate act of allowing what has been concealed to enter awareness, where it can be examined, understood, and integrated. This process does not eliminate discomfort instantly, nor does it guarantee immediate relief. Rather, it restores continuity within the psyche by reducing the separation between the known and the hidden. The significance of confession lies not in the reaction it provokes externally, but in the reorganization it initiates internally. The necessity of such a movement becomes evident when one considers the psychological cost of concealment. To suppress an inner reality requires constant effort, for the mind must sustain barriers that prevent certain contents from surfacing. This effort consumes energy, often producing subtle fatigue, unease, or a sense of internal strain. Over time, the concealed material may exert influence indirectly, appearing through mood shifts, persistent thoughts, or unexplained anxieties. Confession interrupts this cycle by transforming passive suppression into active engagement. What was once guarded becomes accessible to reflection. The psyche, no longer compelled to maintain rigid divisions, begins to recover a sense of balance. This transformation is neither dramatic nor mystical. It is a gradual reallocation of psychological energy. The individual ceases to struggle against their own interior landscape and instead confronts it with clarity. Such confrontation is not an admission of weakness, but an assertion of responsibility toward one's own mental and emotional coherence. Wholeness, however, does not imply perfection or the absence of conflict. It refers instead to a state in which opposing elements of the psyche coexist within awareness, rather than remaining isolated. Confession facilitates this state by permitting disowned aspects of experience to re-enter conscious life. The individual discovers that what was feared as disruptive often becomes intelligible when examined directly. Emotions lose some of their intensity when articulated, and thoughts once perceived as threatening acquire proportion. The psyche functions more harmoniously when its contents are acknowledged rather than resisted. Confession thus becomes a mechanism of integration, allowing disparate fragments of inner experience to reorganize into a more stable structure. The individual's sense of identity expands, no longer defined by avoidance, but by recognition. In this expansion, psychological resilience increases, for the mind is less vulnerable to the distortions produced by unresolved tension. The path toward wholeness, therefore, is not achieved through denial or rigid self-control, but through conscious encounter with what has been avoided. Confession marks a decisive step in this encounter, transforming concealed burdens into elements of awareness. The individual experiences a subtle yet profound shift. Inner life becomes less governed by resistance and more by understanding. Energy once expended in suppression becomes available for growth, reflection, and adaptation. Wholeness emerges not because the psyche is freed from complexity, but because complexity is no longer fragmented. Through confession, the self regains continuity, allowing thought, emotion, and identity to operate within a more unified and authentic equilibrium. Self-confrontation is among the most demanding psychological acts, not because it requires extraordinary intellect, but because it challenges the individual's preferred image of themselves. The mind instinctively constructs narratives of coherence, competence, and consistency, yet beneath these narratives reside contradictions, fears, and unresolved tensions. To confront oneself is to suspend the comfort of familiar explanations and direct attention toward what has been avoided or minimized. This process rarely begins with dramatic revelation. It often arises from a quiet recognition, a sense that certain reactions, anxieties, or conflicts cannot be fully understood through external circumstances alone. The individual senses that the source of disturbance lies within. Such recognition may provoke resistance, for the psyche naturally defends its existing structures, yet avoidance prolongs the tension it seeks to escape. Self-confrontation, though uncomfortable, becomes necessary when inner dissonance persists. It is the deliberate turning inward, where honesty replaces habitual distraction and reflection supersedes denial. The difficulty of this encounter lies in the peculiar nature of the hidden aspects of the psyche. These elements are not always overtly negative or destructive. Many simply conflict with the conscious identity the individual has cultivated. Traits deemed undesirable, memories associated with discomfort,